The dawn that broke over the Rhine-Main Air Base was a pale, watery thing, more a suggestion of light than its full promise, seeping through a low blanket of mist that clung to the edges of the vast tarmac. It was a quiet hour, the kind that exists in the hollows between the end of the night shift and the true beginning of the day, an hour that belonged to mechanics making final checks and to pilots running through mental pre-flight calculations for the 1000th time. In a brightly lit briefing room designated 22C, a space that smelled of stale coffee, old paper, and the faint, sharp tang of industrial cleaner, Captain Maya Flores was the sole occupant, her presence a study in focused solitude. She stood before a large digital map, her finger tracing a line that stretched from Germany, across the churning gray expanse of the Atlantic, all the way to the eastern seaboard of the United States. Her flight plan. Her responsibility. Her mind was already miles ahead, navigating waypoints and calculating fuel burn rates, her dark eyes scanning the meteorological reports for any hint of turbulence that might challenge her aircraft. This was not a glamorous mission. It was a cargo run, the backbone of the Air Force, the uncelebrated circulatory system that kept the entire body of the military functioning. Her aircraft, a hulking C-17 Globemaster III currently sitting silent on the apron, was essentially a flying truck, and she was its driver, a fact she was both proud of and utterly realistic about. She took a slow sip from her thermos, the coffee within still scalding hot, a small personal ritual that grounded her before the immense responsibility of commanding thousands of tons of machinery and the precious, vital cargo within it. Maya's uniform was impeccably maintained, but it showed the slight softness of fabric that has been worn through long hours, a testament to her dedication rather than any lack of care. Her call sign, Shelby, was stitched onto her flight suit, a name that felt both comfortable and deeply personal, a reminder of the small town she came from, a place far removed from the global reach of this air base. She was not a pilot who sought attention. Her satisfaction was derived from the silent, perfect execution of a complex task, from the knowledge that the medical supplies, the communications equipment, the spare parts nestled in the belly of her plane would reach their destination exactly on time, exactly as ordered. The silence of the room was a cocoon, a final moment of peace before the controlled chaos of the mission began. She reviewed the weight and balance figures again, her brow furrowed in concentration, mentally visualizing the cargo hold, ensuring every pallet was secured, every calculation was precise. This was her element, this meticulous preparation, this quiet authority she held over her machine and her mission. The heavy door to briefing room 22C swung open with a sudden, invasive force, shattering the quiet like a stone through glass. The atmosphere shifted instantly, the sterile calm replaced by a wave of boisterous energy and the sharp, expensive scent of jet fuel and aftershave. Major David Sterling filled the doorway, his own flight suit seemingly crisper, his posture radiating a cocksure arrogance that was as much a part of his uniform as the patches on his shoulder. He was a fighter pilot, through and through, from the polished aviator sunglasses perched on his forehead to the way he moved, a swagger that suggested he owned the very air he walked through. He was followed by a small coterie of younger, impressionable lieutenants, all fresh from the high-G euphoria of a training exercise in their F-16s, their laughter too loud for the early hour. Sterling's eyes, a cold, piercing blue, scanned the room and landed on Maya with a look of dismissive amusement, as if he had discovered a peculiar insect he hadn't expected to find in his domain. Well, look what the cat dragged in." Sterling's voice was a drawl, laced with a mocking congeniality that was far worse than outright hostility. "Captain Flores. Burning the midnight oil for the big milk run?" He ambled further into the room, his entourage fanning out behind him, their presence making the space feel suddenly small and cramped. He glanced at the flight plan displayed on the screen and let out a short, derisive laugh. "Washington, D.C.? You're going to need more than coffee to stay awake for that thrilling journey. What's the payload this time? Paper clips and desk chairs?" One of the lieutenants snickered, quickly masking it with a cough. Maya kept her eyes fixed on her data pad, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. She said nothing, employing the oldest and most durable defense: silent professionalism. She willed him to lose interest, to move on with his theatrics. But David Sterling was not a man to be ignored. He leaned against the table next to her, invading her personal space. "I just don't get it, Flores," he continued, his voice dropping to a tone of false confidentiality meant to be overheard by everyone. "All those hours in the simulator, all that training, the raw skill it takes to actually fly a plane. And you use it to what? Play a glorified long-haul trucker? You ever get the itch to actually do something? To feel a real plane under your hands? Something that goes faster than a speeding bullet? He paused, letting the comparison hang in the air. I mean AC-17? You could practically parachute out of it, have a sandwich and catch up to it again. This time the laughter from his followers was less restrained. The humiliation was not in the words themselves, but in their delivery, in the casual cruelty designed to diminish her life's work, to paint her dedication as a form of failure. He was establishing his dominance, reinforcing the pecking order for his audience, using her as the stooge. Maya finally looked up from her pad, meeting his gaze. Her expression was neutral, a mask of professional calm, but a fire of quiet fury burned behind her eyes. She offered no retort. She simply absorbed the insult, metabolized it and stored it away. She had a mission to fly. The weight of it, the real, tangible importance of it, was her armor. And for now it was enough. She turned back to her preparations, a solitary figure in the storm of his arrogance, waiting for it to pass. The silence that Major Sterling left in his wake was a different entity altogether from the peaceful quiet he had shattered upon his entrance. It was a heavy, thick thing, charged with the lingering echoes of his mockery and the faint, embarrassed energy of the junior officers who had followed him out. Captain Maya Flores remained at her station, her posture ramrod straight, her eyes locked on the data pad before her. The numbers and charts on the screen, once a clear and concise roadmap to her mission, now seemed to swim and blur slightly. She took a long, slow, deliberate breath, the kind she had been trained to take in a pressurized cabin losing oxygen, a technique to force clarity and focus when the body screamed for panic. The insult itself was not new. David Sterling's particular brand of arrogance was a known quantity on the base, a low-grade background hum of annoyance that most people in the support and transport divisions had learned to tune out. But the public nature of it, the performative cruelty in front of an audience, the deliberate attempt to poison the well of her confidence just moments before she was to assume command of a multi-million-dollar aircraft and its crucial cargo, that was a calculated act of sabotage that went beyond mere rudeness. It was an attempt to undermine her authority at its very foundation, to make her question her own worth seconds before she needed it most. She could feel the heat of humiliation on her neck, a prickling sensation that warred with the cool, professional detachment she was forcing to the surface. She focused on the tangible, the real, the weight of the thermos in her hand, the smooth plastic of the data pad, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. These were real. His words were just air, vibrations meant to dissipate. She would not give them the power to solidify into doubt. With another measured breath, she gathered her materials, her movements precise and economical. The briefing was over. Her real work was waiting on the tarmac. Outside, the world was awakening in earnest. The mist had begun to burn away under the strengthening sun, revealing the immense, sprawling landscape of the air base. The air, once still, now carried the distant shriek of jet engines starting up, the deep-throated rumble of ground equipment, and the constant, tinny chatter of radio traffic from 100 different sources. It was a symphony of organized chaos, and Maya walked into it, leaving the claustrophobic confines of room 22C behind. The walk to the flight line was a ritual of transition. With every step, she consciously shed the skin of the humiliated captain and donned the mantle of the aircraft commander. Her focus narrowed from the vast, impersonal geography of her flight plan to the very specific, immediate path to her aircraft. There it was, parked a quarter-mile away, a colossal gray silhouette against the brightening sky, the C-17 Globemaster. It was not sleek. It was not elegant. It was a monument to brute force engineering, a flying warehouse with a blunt nose and a high T-shaped tail. To Major Sterling and his ilk, it was an ungainly beast. But to Maya, it was a thing of profound beauty and capability. Its 4 powerful engines could carry a main battle tank, or a company of paratroopers, or as today, a hold full of irreplaceable medical and communications equipment destined for a stateside headquarters. It could land on a short, improvised airstrip or a long, polished runway. It was, in its own way, far more versatile and vital than any single-seat fighter. As she approached, her crew, her co-pilot, her loadmaster, her flight engineer, fell in step with her. They exchanged terse, professional greetings, their faces masks of pre-flight focus. They were her team, a small, dedicated family bound by shared responsibility. They had not witnessed the exchange in 22C, and she would never tell them. Their confidence in her needed to be absolute, and that started with her own unshakable belief in the mission. Meanwhile, in the elevated glass-walled perch of the air traffic control tower, a different kind of transition was taking place. The night shift controllers, weary-eyed and looking forward to their beds, were being relieved by the day shift. The atmosphere was one of routine handover, of coffee cups being refilled and traffic updates being exchanged in a jargon-laden shorthand. It was into this changeover that Major David Sterling arrived, not as a controller but as a privileged visitor. His status as a senior fighter pilot granted him a certain informal access to places like the tower, where he could watch the ballet of aircraft from the best seat in the house, a perk he enjoyed immensely. He swaggered in, clapping a controller on the shoulder, making a loud comment about the weather, his presence an injection of swaggering energy into the technical, subdued environment. He leaned against a console, peering out through the panoramic windows, his eyes instinctively seeking out the sleek forms of the fighter jets on the far side of the field. His gaze, however, inevitably drifted towards the cargo apron, where the large, slow-moving forms of the support aircraft were beginning their daily missions. And there she was, Captain Flores, a tiny figure next to the massive landing gear of her C-17, conducting her final walk-around inspection with her crew. A smirk played on his lips. The memory of her stoic silence, which he had interpreted as weakness, as submission, fueled a fresh wave of contempt. The sheer audacity of her, thinking her job was in any way comparable to his, required a lasting punctuation mark, a final joke that would linger long after he had forgotten about her. His eyes fell on the controller's radar screen, then on the flight progress strip for Flores's mission. There it was printed clearly, call sign, Shelby. It looked so earnest, so quaint. It offended him. It was a name for a family dog, not an Air Force pilot. The idea came to him fully formed, a spark of malicious brilliance. It was a harmless prank, a bit of fun to cap off his morning. The tower was in a state of flux. The senior controller was distracted by a commercial airliner requesting clearance. It was the perfect moment. He casually reached over as if he owned the console, and his fingers danced across the keyboard. It took only a few keystrokes. He deleted Shelby. He paused for a second, considering his options before typing in a new identifier. A call sign that perfectly encapsulated his view of her and her aircraft, a call sign that was both derogatory and, in his mind, hilarious. He entered Mule. The change was instantaneous and official. In the complex, interconnected digital ecosystem of global air traffic control, the aircraft commanded by Captain Maya Flores was now no longer Reach Shelby. It was Reach Mule. He leaned back, immensely pleased with himself, imagining her confusion when she first heard it over the radio, the dawning humiliation. He didn't consider the ramifications, the breach of protocol, the potential for confusion. He saw only the joke. With a final, satisfied glance out the window at the now-named Mule, he turned and left the tower, whistling, his own sense of superiority thoroughly reinforced. The controllers, busy with the real work of managing airspace, barely registered the change, assuming it was a last-minute, authorized amendment. The deed was done. The trap was set, not with malice aforethought, but with the casual, unthinking cruelty of a man who had never been told no. Far below, Maya Flores, now seated in the left-hand seat of the cockpit, began the intricate symphony of starting her engines, utterly unaware that her professional identity had just been stolen and replaced with an insult. The four powerful turbofan engines of the C-17 Globemaster spooled up with a deep, resonant whine that quickly built into a thunderous, earth-shaking roar that vibrated through the very frame of the massive aircraft and into the bones of its crew. Captain Maya Flores, seated in the commanding left seat, her hands resting lightly on the controls, felt the familiar, potent energy course through her. It was a sensation that never grew old, a raw manifestation of power that instantly vaporized the lingering static of Major Sterling's petty insults. Here, in this cockpit, surrounded by a labyrinth of switches, screens and gauges, she was in her true element. The slights of a small-minded man had no place in this realm of physics, engineering and immense responsibility. Her world had narrowed to a perfect, crystalline focus. The instrument panel before her, the voice of the ground controller in her headset, the feel of the aircraft responding to her subtle inputs. The co-pilot to her right ran through the final checklists, his voice calm and professional, and she responded with crisp, confirmed answers. The humiliating interlude in room 22C was now a distant memory, a trivial speck on the ground, left far behind as the giant aircraft began its ponderous, powerful taxi towards the designated runway. The mission was all that mattered. The cargo in the hold, the flight plan in the computer, the destination thousands of miles away, these were the facts that defined her reality now. Liftoff was a controlled, monumental effort. The C-17, for all its immense weight, seemed to gather itself, racing down the runway with increasing urgency before willing itself into the sky with a steady, relentless determination. The landing gear retracted with a heavy thud, a final farewell to terrestrial concerns. They climbed through the layers of cloud, breaking into the brilliant, uncompromising sunlight of the upper atmosphere. The world below transformed into a patchwork quilt of greens and browns, roads and rivers becoming mere threads, the entire complex drama of human life reduced to a silent, beautiful diorama. The roar of the engines settled into a steady, powerful drone, a constant hymn of thrust that was the soundtrack of their journey. Maya engaged the autopilot, but her attention never wavered. Her eyes continuously scanned the instrument readings, cross-checking fuel flow, altitude, airspeed, and heading. The first hour of the flight passed in a state of hyper-focused routine, a seamless integration of woman and machine, a ballet of precision conducted in the empty theater of the sky. The vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean began to unfold beneath them, a seemingly endless plain of deepest blue, its surface occasionally dappled with white clouds whose shadows painted shifting, dark patterns on the water far below. The first radio check was routine, almost mundane. They were transitioning from one air traffic control sector to another, a handoff that happened dozens of times on every long-distance flight. The controller's voice crackled through their headsets, calm and efficient. Reach Mule, contact Boston Center on 132.85. Good day. The co-pilot acknowledged the instruction and switched frequencies. Maya's hand, which had been reaching for her coffee thermos, paused for a fraction of a second. A faint, almost imperceptible frown touched her lips. Mule? Had she heard that correctly? It was so quick, so matter-of-fact from the controller, that she dismissed it as a trick of the radio, a burst of static that had garbled the call sign. Perhaps it was Nile, or Style? Neither made sense. She shook her head slightly, a minor anomaly filed away and forgotten amidst the more critical streams of data requiring her attention. The ocean continued its relentless passage beneath them. The second occurrence was harder to dismiss. An hour later, as they approached a new waypoint, a different controller's voice came through. Reach Mule, climb and maintain flight level 380. This time the transmission was crystal clear. There was no static, no ambiguity. The word was unmistakable. Mule. A cold knot of confusion and dawning disbelief tightened in Maya's stomach. Her co-pilot, a young captain named Evans, glanced over at her, his own brow furrowed in question. He had heard it too. Did he just say, Mule? Evans asked, his voice low. Maya nodded slowly, her mind racing through possibilities. A computer glitch? A misprint in the flight plan filed with command? It seemed bizarre, unbelievable. Must be a mistake in the system, she said, her voice betraying none of the unease she felt. Acknowledge the instruction. Evans complied, his response to the controller professional and neutral, though his tone carried a hint of confusion. Boston Center, Reach Mule, climbing to flight level 380. The acknowledgement was a confirmation. They had now officially identified themselves with the bizarre, derogatory call sign. The word hung in the air of the cockpit, an ugly, incongruous intrusion into their professional sanctuary. Maya's mind, trained for problem-solving, tried to latch onto a logical explanation, but none fit. A systems error would likely have generated a random string of numbers, not a specific, insulting animal name. A miscommunication from the base would have been corrected by now. The only other possibility was so unprofessional, so blatantly against every regulation and standard of conduct she knew, that she initially refused to entertain it. Yet, the memory of Major Sterling's sneering face in the briefing room flashed in her mind. His voice echoed, calling her plane a flying truck. A mule was a pack animal, a dumb, stubborn beast of burden. The connection was too direct, too perfect to be a coincidence. A cold fury began to mix with her confusion. He couldn't have. He wouldn't have dared to compromise an active flight mission for a juvenile prank. The sheer recklessness of it was staggering. To alter an official call sign was to tamper with the very identity of the aircraft in a complex, tightly controlled national system. It was a violation of security, of protocol, of basic decency. She felt a hot flush of humiliation return, but this time it was different. It was no longer just personal, it was a stain on her aircraft, her crew, and her mission. She was flying a crucial cargo run for her country, and someone had seen fit to label her with a joke. The vastness of the ocean outside the cockpit windows suddenly felt isolating, an immense void where this strange, unprofessional secret was theirs alone to bear. She took a deep breath, pushing the anger down. She was still the aircraft commander. Her primary duty was to the safety of the flight. This was a problem for later, for after they landed. For now they were Reach Mule, and they had a job to do. She forced her focus back to the horizon, her jaw set, the insult now a cold, hard stone in her gut, accompanying her across the thousands of miles of empty ocean. The C-17 droned on, a solitary speck of disciplined engineering traversing the trackless blue desert of the North Atlantic. Inside the cockpit, the atmosphere had shifted from one of focused routine to a tense, silent vigil. The constant, reassuring hum of the engines now felt like an accomplice to the bizarre secret they were forced to carry. Every radio transmission was awaited with a sense of dread, every crackle of static a potential delivery of that hated identifier. Captain Evans, the co-pilot, would glance at Maya after each communication, his expression a mixture of shared indignation and helpless confusion. Maya's face was a mask of professional composure, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the controls during manual flight segments, and the set of her shoulders was rigid with a suppressed fury that was far more volatile than any storm system on her weather radar. The insult, once a vague humiliation, had crystallized into a cold, hard certainty in her mind. This was Sterling's work. The timing, the specific nature of the slur, it all fit. The violation was profound. He hadn't just mocked her in a room. He had hacked into the sanctity of her mission, tattooing a joke onto the skin of her aircraft for the entire air traffic control network to see. It was an act of breathtaking arrogance and stupidity, a privileged boy pulling the wings off a fly, utterly oblivious to the complex ecosystem he was tampering with. Her mind raced through the protocols for reporting such an incident, the forms to be filed, the statements to be given. It would be her word against that of a decorated major. The process would be long, arduous, and likely inconclusive. The stone of anger in her gut felt heavier with each passing mile. Hundreds of miles away, but cruising at a similar altitude and on a converging flight path, moved another aircraft, one that was anything but solitary. Airforceone, the majestic blue and white VC-25, was a flying command post, a symbol of American power whose every movement was tracked, supported, and protected by a vast, invisible network. Inside its soundproofed, pressurized cabin, the atmosphere was one of weary focus. President Jonathan Wright, having concluded a grueling NATO summit, was utilizing the long flight home not for rest but for work. Surrounded by senior advisors, he was deep in a briefing on a complex foreign aid package, his brow furrowed as he examined a detailed map on a tablet. The cabin was quiet, the only sounds the muffled drone of the engines and the soft, professional tones of his staff. As a former Air Force reservist who had flown cargo missions in his youth, the president possessed a latent, subconscious awareness of the aerial environment around him. The specialized communications gear on the aircraft often picked up snippets of air traffic control chatter, a background hum of global mobility that he usually filtered out as professional white noise. It was a stray transmission, a voice clear and distinct amidst the low murmur that snagged his attention. Reach Mule, Boston Center, radar contact. Maintain flight level 380. The president's head, which had been bent over the tablet, lifted slightly. His eyes, tired from hours of negotiation, lost their focus on the map before him. He didn't interrupt his aide, but a part of his brain, the part trained on flight decks and in control towers, had been activated. Reach Mule. The call sign echoed in his mind. It was wrong. It was dissonant. In a system built on precision, clarity, and respect, a call sign was an aircraft's identity. Reach was the standard prefix for a military airlift mission. The suffix was always a unique identifier, often a name, a number, a word of significance. Mule was none of those things. It was a slang term, a derogatory one at that, implying stubbornness, dullness, a mere beast of burden. It was the kind of nickname enlisted crews might use affectionately amongst themselves for a tough old aircraft, but it was utterly inappropriate for official air traffic control use. It spoke of a casual disrespect, a breakdown in discipline. It was an anomaly, and Jonathan Wright, whether by temperament or training, was a man who noticed anomalies. He held up a hand, gently stopping the flow of his aide's briefing. "One moment, David," he said quietly. He listened for another few minutes, his gaze distant, fixed on nothing in the elegant cabin. The call sign came again, this time from a different controller. "Reach Mule, Squawk Ident." And then, a moment later, the response. A female voice, professional, clear, but with a detectable undercurrent of something else. Resignation? Annoyance? That only someone listening for it might hear. Boston Center, Reach Mule, squawking. That sealed it for the president. There was a crew up there doing their job, being forced to identify themselves with a term that was clearly an insult. It was a small thing, perhaps, in the grand scheme of global politics, but it was a crack in the foundation of the institution he commanded. It was a symptom of a rot he despised. The abuse of authority, the powerful belittling the less powerful for sport. He turned to his military aide, an Air Force colonel who sat attentively nearby. "Colonel," the president said, his voice calm but leaving no room for question. "That aircraft, Reach Mule? I want to know what that's about. Get me a comm link." The order, delivered in such a measured tone, sent a ripple of instantaneous action through the aircraft. The colonel's professionalism didn't allow for a moment's hesitation or question. He moved to the communications console, speaking in low, urgent tones to the flight crew up front. On the flight deck of Air Force One, the command was received as absolute. The senior pilot, a grizzled Air Force general, nodded and personally handled the frequency change. The radio in Maya's cockpit, which had been silent save for the periodic check-ins, suddenly crackled to life with a new, powerfully clear voice that carried an unmistakable authority. Reach Mule, this is Air Force One on guard. How do you copy?" In the C-17 the effect was electric. Captain Evans physically jolted in his seat, his eyes wide with sheer disbelief. Maya's breath caught in her throat. Air Force One. It was impossible. It was unthinkable. The presidential aircraft was hailing them. Her mind, already reeling from the day's events, scrambled for purchase. This had to be related to the call sign. It had to be. The prank had just escalated beyond any conceivable dimension. With a hand that trembled slightly, she keyed the mic, her voice straining for its usual professional calm. "Air Force One, this is Reach Mule, we read you loud and clear." The acknowledgement hung in the ether, a connection between the most famous aircraft in the world and one that had been branded with a humiliating joke. There was a brief pause, a silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity, filled only with the hum of the engines and the pounding of two hearts in the C-17 cockpit. Then a new voice came over the frequency. It was calmer, older, and carried a weight that could only belong to one man. It was not loud, but it was perfectly enunciated, every word chosen with care. "Reach Mule, this is Jonathan Wright. I couldn't help but notice your call sign. I'm familiar with the Reach designation. Would you mind telling me the nature of your mission today?" The question was simple, polite, almost conversational, but it was asked by the commander-in-chief from the cockpit of his own plane. Maya felt a surreal disconnect, as if she had been dropped into a dream. She forced herself to respond, her training taking over where her composure was fraying. "Mr. President, this is Captain Flores, aircraft commander. We are on a routine cargo flight from Rhine-Main to Joint Base Andrews, sir. Transporting priority medical and communications equipment." She kept it precise by the book. The voice came back, still calm but now with a subtle, probing intensity. "I see. And Captain Flores, was Mule the call sign you filed with your flight plan?" The question was direct. It was the question she had been dreading. It was the moment of truth. There was no protocol for this. There was only honesty. She took a breath, the entire humiliating scene in room 22C flashing before her eyes. "No, sir," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength, a hint of the indignity she had suffered. "It was not. Our filed call sign was Shelby. We became aware of the change only after we were airborne and began receiving instructions from ATC." The line was silent for a long moment. In the luxurious cabin of Air Force One, President Wright leaned back in his seat, his lips pressed into a thin, hard line. He didn't need to hear any more. The picture was complete. A dedicated crew, a vital mission, and some individual with a petty streak of cruelty and enough access to compromise the system. He had heard the strain in the captain's voice, the professional restraint masking deep frustration. He knew that tone. He had felt that feeling himself long ago, when a superior had tried to diminish his own service. He keyed the mic again, his decision made. "Understood, Captain. Thank you for that information. And thank you for your service. Stand by." He released the mic and turned to his military aide, his expression now one of resolved command. "Give me the Secretary of the Air Force. Now." The game was over. The joke had just landed at the highest possible level. The silence that followed the president's "stand-by" was the most profound and unnerving sound Captain Maya Flores had ever experienced. It was a void, a vacuum that sucked all the air and reason from the cockpit. The constant, reassuring drone of the engines now felt like the countdown to an unknown, terrifying consequence. Her mind, usually a model of orderly procedure, spiraled through a vortex of worst-case scenarios. Had she just inadvertently declared war on the Air Force chain of command? Had her simple, honest answer to the most powerful man on Earth just ended her career? Would they be intercepted, forced to land at some remote base, her aircraft impounded and her crew detained for questioning? She saw the look of sheer, unadulterated panic on Captain Evans's face, a mirror of the cold dread solidifying in her own chest. They were alone over the ocean, trapped in a bubble of metal and fuel, at the center of a storm they had not created but were now powerless to escape. Every second of the silence stretched into an agony of anticipation. The professional humiliation inflicted by Sterling was now a trivial concern, utterly eclipsed by the monumental, earth-shattering fact that the President of the United States was personally involved in their bizarre situation. On board Air Force One, the silence was of a completely different nature. It was a silence of intense, focused activity. President Wright's order, delivered in that calm, unequivocal tone, had triggered a meticulously orchestrated chain of command that bypassed a dozen layers of bureaucracy and went straight to the very top. The military aide, having secured an encrypted satellite link, spoke not to a subordinate, but directly to the Secretary of the Air Force himself, who was at a policy dinner in Washington, D.C. The Secretary, hearing the President's personal concern and the brief, shocking details of the compromised call sign, excused himself from his table without a word. In the span of minutes, the inquiry became a firestorm raging through the highest echelons of the Pentagon. The question was not just about a call sign, it was about a breach of protocol so severe it had drawn the attention of the Commander-in-Chief. It was about the integrity of the entire air traffic control system. It was about the culture of the service he led. The Secretary's first call was not to a public affairs officer, but to the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. This was now a formal inquiry, and it demanded the highest priority. The shockwave of this presidential attention radiated outwards at the speed of light, leaping from the satellite over the Atlantic to the Pentagon, and then directly to the desk of Colonel James Bear Henderson at Rhine-Main Air Base. He was in his office, reviewing maintenance logs, when his secure line rang with a specific, urgent tone he heard only a few times a year. The voice on the other end was a general from the Air Staff, and it was devoid of any pleasantries. "Henderson, we have a situation. A critical one. One of your aircraft, AC-17, call sign filed as Shelby, is currently being identified as Reach Mule on all ATC frequencies. The President of the United States is on a personal comms link with the aircraft commander right now and is demanding answers. What the hell happened on your flight line?" For a man known for his unflappable composure, the colonel felt the floor beneath him sway. The President. The words were so absurd he almost laughed, but the ice-cold tone of the general on the phone confirmed this was a nightmare made real. He immediately assured the general he would personally investigate and report back within minutes. Hanging up the phone, his mind, a tactical computer, immediately began processing. A call sign change. It was a digital alteration. Access. Who had access? The image of David Sterling, swaggering out of the briefing room earlier that morning, flashed in his mind. Sterling's arrogance, his contempt for the transport division, his privileged access to the tower. It was a sickeningly perfect fit. Henderson didn't summon Sterling. He moved. He left his office at a pace just short of a run, his face a granite mask of impending judgment. He bypassed his assistant, ignored the salutes of junior officers in the hallway, and went straight to the air traffic control tower. The controllers, sensing the arrival of their furious commander, fell into a tense silence. Henderson didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone was an indictment. "The flight logs for Reach Shelby," he demanded, his voice a low, controlled rumble. "Now, I want the change history. Every keystroke." A senior controller, pale-faced, pulled up the digital record on a main console. There it was in stark, unforgiving text on the screen. Call sign, Shelby. Then a time-stamped amendment. User, Sterling.d. Authorization, override. New call sign, Mule. The evidence was irrefutable, a digital fingerprint of stupidity and malice. Henderson felt a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. Sterling hadn't just bullied a junior officer. He had compromised a mission, violated security protocols, and humiliated the entire base on a global stage in front of the President. "Secure this terminal," Henderson ordered, his voice dangerously quiet. "No one touches anything. OSI will be here shortly." He turned and left, his course now set. He found Major David Sterling not in a briefing room or a hangar, but in the officers' club, already celebrating the end of his own shift with a scotch, regaling a few younger pilots with an exaggerated version of his morning, undoubtedly omitting his own role. He saw Henderson approaching and smiled, raising his glass in a casual, familiar gesture that died instantly when he saw the colonel's expression. Henderson didn't stop until he was inches from Sterling, his eyes burning with a cold fire. Major. My office. Now. The words were not an invitation. They were a sentence. In the sanctum of the commander's office with the door closed, Henderson didn't sit. He stood behind his desk, placing his hands flat on the surface. The call sign, Sterling, he said, dispensing with any preamble. You changed it? To Mule? Sterling's face went through a rapid series of transformations. Initial arrogance, then confusion, then dawning fear as he realized the colonel knew. He attempted a weak, dismissive smile. Sir, it was just a bit of fun. A harmless joke. Captain Flores needs to learn to take a... Henderson cut him off, his voice rising to a thunderous level for the first time. A joke? He roared, making Sterling flinch. Your joke just diverted the attention of the President of the United States. Your joke has the Office of Special Investigations and the Secretary of the Air Force on the phone. You compromised an active flight mission. You violated every security protocol we have. For a joke. The color drained completely from Sterling's face. His arrogance evaporated, replaced by the stark, terrified realization of the abyss he had just plunged into. He tried to speak, to offer some defense, but no words came out. He just stood there, a man watching his entire career, his entire identity vaporize before his eyes. You are relieved of duty, effective immediately, Henderson stated, each word a hammer blow. You will surrender your sidearm and your credentials to the security forces outside that door. You will not speak to anyone. You will await the arrival of OSI investigators. Do you understand me, Major? Sterling could only nod, his body seeming to shrink inside his flight suit. The swagger was gone, replaced by the tremble of a man who had finally, catastrophically, flown too close to the sun. Back over the Atlantic, the silence in the C-17 was finally broken. The same clear, authoritative voice from Air Force One returned to their frequency. Reach Mule, this is Air Force One. Be advised, we are altering our flight path to rendezvous with your position. Please maintain your current heading and speed. The instruction was so surreal, so far outside any flight manual ever written, that both Maya and Evans could only stare at each other in utter disbelief. Rendezvous? With them? They watched, speechless, as on their radar screen, the distinct, coded blip that was Air Force One began a slow, graceful turn, its course now definitively intersecting their own. It was a gesture of monumental significance, a symbol of support so powerful it was overwhelming. They were no longer a mocked aircraft with a shameful call sign. They were under the direct, protective wing of the presidency. The humiliation inflicted by a small man in a position of petty authority had been answered by the largest possible gesture of respect from the highest possible authority. The stone of anger in Maya's gut began to dissolve, replaced by a tremulous, awe-filled sense of vindication that was as terrifying as it was glorious. The sky itself had just chosen a side. The descent into Joint Base Andrews was unlike any landing Captain Maya Flores had ever executed. It was a procedure conducted under a microscope, a ballet performed on a global stage where every radio call, every adjustment of thrust, every gentle bank was witnessed by the most prestigious wingman in the world. The presence of Air Force One, holding a respectful but unmistakable position off their starboard wing, was a constant, surreal reality that filled the cockpit windows. The colossal blue and white aircraft, an icon of American power, was flying in formation with them, a silent, powerful statement that echoed louder than any words over the radio. The initial shock and terror had subsided, replaced by a hyper-focused, almost out-of-body professionalism. Maya's hands on the controls were steady, her voice calm as she communicated with approach control, but her mind was reeling, trying to process the enormity of what was happening. The shaming call sign Reach Mule was still their official identifier in the system, a lingering stain, but it had been utterly redefined, transformed from a mark of humiliation into a badge of unprecedented honor by the simple, profound act of the presidential escort. The shame belonged to someone else now, far away, and she could feel the weight of it lifting from her shoulders with every mile they flew closer to home. On the ground, the normally orderly environment of Joint Base Andrews had been transformed into a hive of controlled, urgent activity. The news of Air Force One's unscheduled diversion to escort a cargo plane had spread through the command structure like a shockwave, bypassing normal channels and igniting a flurry of speculation and preparation. A standard cargo reception, usually a few ground crew and a fuel truck, was suddenly upgraded to a high-priority event. Senior base officers, their faces a mixture of confusion and keen interest, appeared on the flight line. Security was subtly reinforced. The control tower was operating with heightened awareness, every controller knowing their every word was being scrutinized. The air was thick with unasked questions. What was so important on that C-17? Was it a national security incident? A heroic act no one knew about? The truth that it was a response to a profound breach of military decorum and a personal gesture of support from the commander-in-chief was beyond anyone's guess. They prepared to receive not just a cargo plane but a mystery. As Maya flared the massive C-17, settling it onto the runway with a gentle sigh of tires meeting pavement, she could see the unusual reception committee waiting for them. It was far more than her crew warranted. The moment the aircraft rolled to a stop and she began the lengthy process of shutting down the engines, a sense of surreal exhaustion washed over her. The mission was complete. The cargo was safe. But the journey was not over. As the whine of the engines faded into silence, replaced by the clicks and pings of the cooling airframe, the external world began to intrude. A set of air stairs was rolled up to the crew door. She exchanged a long, wordless look with Captain Evans. The shared experience of the last few hours had created a bond that would never be broken, but now they had to face whatever came next. She unbuckled her harness, her muscles aching with a fatigue that was more emotional than physical, and prepared to meet the consequences of a day that had defied all logic. She opened the crew door to a scene of breathtaking incongruity. The familiar sights and sounds of the cargo apron were there, the fuel trucks, the generators, the distant shout of a loadmaster. But in the foreground, standing a respectful distance away, was a group of high-ranking officers, their expressions unreadable. And parked a few hundred yards away, having landed moments after them, was airforceone, its own doors opening to disgorge its own important passengers. The world seemed to hold its breath. Maya descended the stairs, her crew following behind her. The senior officer, a two-star general she recognized as the base commander, stepped forward. His salute was crisp, perfect. Maya and her crew returned it. "Captain Flores," the general said, his voice formal but not unkind. "On behalf of Joint Base Andrews, welcome home. We are aware of the unusual circumstances of your flight. The Secretary of the Air Force has ordered a full and immediate inquiry. These gentlemen," he gestured to two severe-looking men in plain uniforms who stood slightly apart, their bearing radiating a quiet, serious authority, "are from the Office of Special Investigations. They will need a statement from you and your crew at your earliest convenience." He did not mention the call sign. He did not need to. Its presence hung over the entire proceedings like a ghost. Before Maya could respond, a subtle shift in the atmosphere occurred. The attention of the officers on the tarmac shifted from her to a point behind her. She turned. A small motorcade of dark vehicles had pulled up near airforceone, and walking from that group, flanked by aides and security but unmistakably the center of gravity, was President Jonathan Wright. He had not immediately boarded his helicopter. He had chosen to walk across the active flight line. He approached the group, his expression sober. The general and all the officers snapped to attention, saluting again. The president returned the salute casually, his eyes scanning the group before landing squarely on Maya. He walked directly up to her, ignoring the generals and the colonels. "Captain Flores," he said, extending his hand. His grip was firm. "That was a fine piece of flying. Thank you for getting your important cargo home safely." It was a simple statement, but delivered in this context, in front of this audience, it was a monumental absolution. He then turned his gaze to the base commander. "General, I trust the Air Force will get to the bottom of how one of its dedicated flight crews was subjected to such an unprofessional and compromising situation. I'll be expecting a report." The message was clear, delivered calmly but with the immense weight of his office. This was not a request, it was an expectation. With a final nod to Maya, a look that conveyed a world of understanding and respect, he turned and walked back toward his waiting motorcade. His work was done. He had ensured the story would not end with the landing. He had placed his thumb on the scale of justice, and the entire Air Force command structure had felt it. The investigation was no longer a formality, it was a direct order from the commander-in-chief. The humiliation had been witnessed, and it would be answered. The days that followed the landing at Joint Base Andrews were a whirlwind of a different sort for Captain Maya Flores, a tempest of procedure and protocol that replaced the thunder of engines. The initial debriefing with the stern, methodical agents from the Office of Special Investigations was intense and exhaustive, stretching for hours in a sterile, windowless room. They asked every conceivable question, and Maya answered with unwavering honesty, recounting the humiliation in room 22C, the first confusing radio call, the dawning horror of realization, and the surreal moment airforceone had hailed them. She provided the facts without embellishment, Her statement a dry, clinical account that somehow made Major Sterling's actions seem even more petty and reckless. The OSI agents took meticulous notes, their faces impassive, but she sensed a current of professional disgust running beneath their calm exteriors. They had seen abuses of power before, but rarely one so stupid and so public. After she signed her statement, she was told she and her crew were free to go, but to remain available. The waiting began. The Air Force, as a massive and ancient institution, moved with a slow, deliberate pace, especially when handling its own scandals. The story, however, did not remain a secret. It was too good, too cinematic. Whispers of the mule and the presidential escort spread through the base, then through military blogs, then into the wider world, becoming a modern-day military legend. The formal inquiry was convened in a large, wood-paneled auditorium on base, a room usually reserved for change-of-command ceremonies and high-level briefings. The atmosphere was solemn and heavy with consequence. Seated at the central table were senior officers forming the review board, their faces grave. On one side of the room sat Maya, her crew, and Colonel Henderson, a united front of quiet dignity. On the other, alone at a small table, sat Major David Sterling. He looked diminished, a shell of the swaggering man from the briefing room. His uniform was perfect, but it hung on him as if he had lost weight overnight. His arrogance had been completely hollowed out, replaced by a pale, sweating anxiety. He kept his eyes fixed on the table in front of him, unable to meet the gaze of the officers who would decide his fate. The hearing proceeded with a grim formality. The evidence was presented. The digital log from the control tower showing his user ID and the timestamp of the change, the audio recordings from the C-17's cockpit and from airforceone, the statements from Maya and her crew. It was an airtight case, a mountain of evidence built on a foundation of his own juvenile arrogance. When it was his turn to speak, Sterling stood. His voice, once a booming instrument of mockery, was now a reedy, hesitant thing. He offered an apology, but it was a weak, selfish thing, a masterpiece of deflection. He spoke of a lapse in judgment, of intra-service joking that went too far, of not fully considering the ramifications. He said he was sorry if anyone was offended, and that he never meant to compromise any mission. It was an apology designed not to seek forgiveness from the woman he had wronged, but to salvage the shattered remnants of his career. He was sorry he got caught. He was sorry the president had been listening. He was sorry his joke had blown up in his face. The emptiness of his words hung in the silent room, a final, pathetic confirmation of his character. The board members listened, their expressions unchanging. When he finished and sat down, the air felt colder. It was then that Colonel Henderson asked to address the board in the room. He stood, a solid, imposing figure of authority, and his voice, when he spoke, was not the thunderous roar he had used on Sterling in private, but a low, powerful, and deeply disappointed rumble that carried to every corner of the auditorium. "Sirs," he began, "this incident is not, as Major Sterling would have you believe, a simple joke that missed its mark. It is a fundamental failure of character. It is a betrayal of the trust that is the bedrock of this service. Captain Flores and her crew were executing a vital mission for this nation. They deserved support, they deserved respect, they deserved professionalism. Instead, they were subjected to a deliberate, calculated act of humiliation that compromised their focus and dishonored the uniform we all wear." He turned his gaze to Sterling, and it was like a physical weight. "The apology offered here today is not an apology. It is an excuse. It continues the same pattern of disrespect by failing to acknowledge the true depth of the offense." He then turned to Maya. "Captain Flores, on behalf of the command and on behalf of every officer who believes in the values we swore to uphold, I offer you a true and full apology. We failed you. The system designed to protect you from this exact brand of toxicity failed you. Your professionalism in the face of such petty adversity was, and is, a credit to the United States Air Force. It is a standard to which we should all aspire." His words were not just for her. They were for the entire service, a clear renunciation of the culture Sterling represented. It was the apology that mattered, the one that acknowledged the systemic failure, not just the individual act. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Major David Sterling was found to have violated multiple articles of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. He was formally censured, stripped of his flight status, and reduced in rank to captain. More importantly, he was given a permanent black mark on his record and reassigned to a dead-end desk job in a remote logistics office, far from any aircraft, any command, and any personnel he could possibly bully. His career in any meaningful sense was over. The message was sent, loud and clear, through every rank of the Air Force. Integrity matters, humility matters, and abuse of authority will not be tolerated. For Maya, there was no joy in his downfall, only a quiet sense of closure. The stone that had been lodged in her gut since room 22C was finally gone. She was not just vindicated, she was celebrated. A formal commendation was placed in her permanent file, citing her exceptional poise and professionalism under extraordinary and duplicitous circumstances. The respect she received from her peers was now deep and genuine, born of shared understanding rather than mere politeness. Weeks later, Maya was walking back to her quarters after a long, completely normal cargo run, her call sign Shelby restored and respected. The sky was turning a deep twilight purple, and the air was cool and calm. She felt a sense of peace, of having passed through a storm and emerged stronger on the other side. The lesson was etched into her soul, not as a scar but as a strength. True power is not in the roar of a fighter jet or the rank on a uniform, but in the quiet competence to do your duty with honor, no matter how unglamorous that duty may seem. It is in the courage to stand firm against pettiness, and in the integrity to always do what is right, especially when no one is watching. And sometimes, though you should never expect it, that integrity is witnessed and honored in the most incredible ways, a reminder that the wheels of justice, while often slow, do indeed turn. And if you found this story of resilience and unexpected vindication compelling, a reminder that standing up for what is right can have reverberations far beyond what you can imagine, then consider following this channel for more narratives that explore the powerful moments where ordinary people confront extraordinary challenges. Your subscription helps bring more such stories to light.